hello out there. Thank you to everyone who's joining us right now. Welcome to the Smarter Career Moves LinkedIn live show. I'm so excited to be here today. I met you, Monisha. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yep.
I met you through Forbes Coaches Council, and we had a conversation, and I was hoping to find someone with the, communication expertise. And so I am so excited to have you here with me today. And I just want to say to everyone out in the audience, please do say hello and let us know where you are joining from, and put your questions in the chat. So please do tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Sure. Thank you, Annette. I'm so excited to join you here today, and thank you so much for reaching out. My name is Monisha Toteja, and I'm the CEO of Dynamic Speaking. It's a communication coaching company that focuses on helping everyone, executives, managers, and rising stars, in their communication and their public speaking skills. So that can range from everything from executive presence to pitching, to networking, to leading teams and meetings, to having difficult conversations, anything that touches the oral communication world. I also taught communication at Wharton for about 8 years and was a part-time lecturer there. So I've been doing this quite a while, and I love talking to people about communication.
Well, I'm so happy again, as I said, to have you here. I just want to say hello to some friends in the audience. Nick Rayburn, hi. Thank you so much for being here. Hello to my friends Tina and Dammy and my colleague Paula. And oh my goodness, we have so many people joining us. And so someone from India. Medulla, I think. I'm giving that my best shot at your name. So thank you so much to everyone for being here today. Really excited. So, I think being able to communicate effectively is certainly essential, whether you're working in corporate or if you're someone like me and, you're looking for new clients, working with new clients. Unfortunately, I think most people think of improving their communication skill in terms of being a better writer. So they might take some kind of a writing course. But to me, I also think it's like having a sense of humor. Everybody thinks they have a sense of humor, and but most people, or many people do not. And people think that they are good communicators. So, or I should say, better communicators than they actually are. So, what do you think are some misconceptions? Maybe you can give us three about what makes someone an effective communicator.
Sure, happy to. One of the biggest misconceptions I see with communication is that people think the way they said something is the same way that somebody else heard it. And what we do when we think that way is we have a very self-focused view. So we put ourselves first and we say, well, this was my message or this was my intent. And clearly, this is how it was going to come across. Now, the reality is that perception can be very different. And depending on your audience and what filters they have, depending on the tone you use, the language you used, and a whole host of other things, it may have come across very differently. And in fact, could be the opposite of what you intended. So that would be the first misconception. The second misconception about public speaking or being an effective communicator is that it's innate. And I come across this all the time where people just say, oh, they're just naturally a good speaker. They were born that way. They're just charismatic. There's nothing else you can do about it. And that's simply not true. You can take it back, peel back all these different layers and look at the different facets of communication. And you can see that people build up different habits over time. So when you build up very effective, good speaking technique, when you learn the rhetoric, you can have very effective communication. And if you don't, or you're practicing bad habits, or you've never learned them, then you will just be practicing a different skill set. So it's really about your mindset in terms of being willing to learn and being willing to try. So that would be the second misconception. And then the third misconception I would give you is that I see this quite a bit too, is people say, well, I'm just really nervous or I don't like groups, and so I'm never going to be a good speaker. And again, that's simply not true, because anyone has the potential to be a great speaker, but you have to work within the realm of what's comfortable to you and what's authentic to you. So you have to push yourself a little bit. You can't be fully comfortable. Sometimes it is a little uncomfortable, but you have to stay true to yourself. That said, we all have a range of what works for us. We don't all speak in the same tone and the same volume for every situation in life. So each of us has a range. And the key is figuring out what that range is that's authentic and still engaging to the audience. But the nervousness is something that we can overcome, and it's not something that should hold people back.
I love what you said. You mentioned something about sort of practicing, techniques. So, we have several people in the audience and people will be listening on the replay. And, I certainly would like to, if you can share a few things that people can work on to become more effective communicators. I mentioned to you, we were talking before we went live. This is something I'm trying to work on myself to up my game. So what can you share that people can say, you know what, I'm going to start trying this or that today?
The biggest thing is actually figuring out your breathing pattern and figuring out how to breathe and speak appropriately. Now, one of the things I will say is, when we're babies, we breathe through our diaphragm. So we basically pull all the air down. And if you've ever seen a little baby sleeping, you see their belly goes up and down.
Yeah.
And then if you see adults when they're speaking, mostly you see the chest go in and out. So throughout time, we basically shift our breathing pattern. And what we want to do if you're going to be speaking is you want to shift it back to more of that diaphragm breathing. So working on taking bigger inhales, pulling the breath all the way down into the belly. And then the key here is exhaling and speaking simultaneously. What I found is that many people, by the time they've hit adulthood, have started holding their breath while they're speaking. And that can lead to a whole host of issues. But what you want to do is you start your exhale, and then you can start with a simple exercise of just saying hello. And when you start it initially, it's going to sound funny because you're going to take a breath in and then exhale and say hello. And you want to try to push the air out of your lungs and use your vocal cords at the same time. And that's one of the biggest things. That will help with projection, with volume. It will help with strength. It will help drop off filler words. There are a number of things that will help with that breathing technique. So that's one of the biggest ones that people can start right away.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's a really fun one. It is actually seemingly simple because you're like, well, everybody breathes, but it's actually not nearly as easy as it seems when you've built up decades of a different habit.
Oh, I'm sure not. It doesn't sound easy to me at all. So what's something else people can try?
All right. So in addition to that, there are a number of other things. One is trying to think about where you put the pauses in your sentence. When we're writing, when we're reading, we have different signposts. We have a comma, a period, a semicolon, a colon, and those tell us where the thoughts break up and where we should pause. When we're speaking, we don't have those same signposts. So our breath is used to end those phrases. Now, a lot of people will take breaths just whenever they run out of air. And oftentimes that's in the middle of a sentence, or we end up with a lot of run-on sentences if people are speaking very quickly. So being purposeful about where you put the pauses and where you take your breath can really help with signposting and also giving people an idea of where you're going and what phrases belong together. Another thing to think about that's not delivery related is more about how you structure your communication. If you want to stay concise and you want to be succinct, then structure plays a huge role in helping you do that. It also helps the audience understand where you're going to be going in your speech or in your presentation, and it'll help the audience follow along so that they don't get lost. And if you can keep your audience with you, then you've got a better chance of your message getting across.
Well, this sounds a little bit like I did some video training actually with my friend Nick. And one of the things that he taught me was to record my videos one line at a time. So that I'm not rambling and your technique sounds a little bit like that, to sort of think of it in terms of sort of one chunk or something, a sentence at a time.
Exactly. You do want to think about how you're structuring your words and your sentences, because very long run on sentences can be hard to follow. And especially for the listener, you got to keep in mind that the listener doesn't know what you're saying. So you know what you're saying because it's in your head, but the listener has no idea where you're going. So when you start talking and then you keep going and then you keep going and then you keep going, it can be very confusing for the listener to say, well, what was the point, or why am I listening to that? So a little bit of structure or breaking up the sentences into smaller pieces can be very helpful.
Okay, so Nick says that he's practicing this right now. I'm guessing he's talking about the breathing.
Excellent.
So, yeah, it does. It sounds like that, breaking it up, and also what you said about, seeing the signposts when you're reading and understanding. It's like, I work with a professional proofreader because before I send, projects to my clients, because I see what I wrote. And so, but she looks at it objectively. So, when it comes to, if you can, we're talking about practicing all these things and the communication skills, and I can understand, that I can practice the breathing on my own. But what about if I want to start, if I'm doing a presentation or I'm preparing for a meeting? That meeting might be me asking my boss for a raise.
Mm-hmm.
How do I prep for that beforehand? If you can somehow give us some, I'm sure you can give us some suggestions.
Yeah. If you're going to prep for a big meeting or something like a negotiation, you definitely want to step back first and think about what's your goal, who you're talking to in terms of your audience, and then how do you structure your message to be effective. So the first thing is a lot of thinking that goes into it. Now, in terms of what your goal is, if it's a negotiation and your goal is to get a better raise, more of a raise, think about having whatever that dollar figure is in mind. Also think about other benefits that you would be willing to take in addition to or instead of a monetary raise. So think about the entire goal there. Then in terms of the audience, you really want to think about who's the other person in the room. So what do you know about your boss? What do you know about their communication style? What types of things do they listen for? How does language resonate with them? Think about your relationship you have with them, and then try to figure out what's the language where it's going to connect. What language is actually going to connect with the other person? So going back to the first point we made at the very opening, it's not just about here's my message and here's what I need to say. It's also about how is this going to be perceived from the receiving end? So a little bit of thinking through the audience's lens of, well, if I say this, what are they going to think? So understanding the audience there. And then in terms of structuring the content, it's really about making sure you get your key points across and staying very tight and very succinct. Thinking about how to frame things positively instead of negatively, so that things become a no-brainer. You want to showcase what you've done. You want to highlight this. And after you go through it, you structure it so that you can lay out your argument. And at the end of it, it should feel like a no-brainer that, of course, you should get a raise. So if you can lay out your argument in that fashion, it will be more persuasive. And then, again, keeping your audience in mind, you have to know how this is going to be received, but you have a better chance of success at that point.
I love this whole thing is so incredibly helpful for me, and I'm sure for others. But it also sounds like a big chunk of this is planning. It's like a lot of things, planning in advance, right? Just being, really careful about what you're doing. So I'd like to turn a little bit to the speaking. I mean, you are a speaker, and as you mentioned, you spent several years as a lecturer at Wharton, coaching MBA students, to be more effective communicators. And I noticed that it was primarily for, public speaking or sort of persuasive speaking. And I guess that persuasive speaking also can be part of, maybe a job interview. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But before we move on to that, I'm sure you've heard that saying that most people fear public speaking more than they fear death. And I just looked up yesterday, and according to the National Institutes of Mental Health, that's 75% of people rank that as their number one fear as public speaking. I know, it used to make me nervous. Now I enjoy it, but still, could be much, much better than I am. But the thing is, people do get nervous, speaking in meetings and speaking in job interviews. So how can people overcome that? A lot of people, and I will say I see it more with the women clients that I work with. They sit in meetings and they're afraid to, speak up, and often, even if they say something, someone else will repeat, switch it up a little bit and repeat it, and then the other person gets the credit. So how can people be more effective in meetings, first of all, and then in job interviews?
There are so many things to unpack in that question. So let me
I know. It's a biggie.
let me give you a few ideas in terms of how to be more effective. And first of all, dealing with the nerves. The first thing is going back to that breathing. The breathing technique is going to be huge because your breathing and your heart rate are linked. So when your heart rate speeds up, your breathing gets more shallow, but it can go both ways. So if you pull back your breathing, you can also pull down your heart rate. So that's the first thing in terms of breathing. But breathing aside, a little bit of structure goes a very long way. So just a little bit of thought and planning, and this doesn't have to be extensive planning. So I do talk a little bit about planning, but this doesn't mean you have to prep for an hour. It means 30 seconds. You can give it a little bit of thought to say, what are the key points that I'm trying to get across? And just bullet point 2 to 3 words of what you're really trying to say and what you want to make sure comes across. And that little bit of structure helps keep you focused and helps keep the meeting focused as well. It also lets you hone in on what you're really trying to say. So when you jump in, that you know exactly what your focal point is. I'll give you 4 reasons total. The third
Okay.
one is to focus on the positive or enjoyable aspects. So not everybody loves speaking, and that's totally fine. Some people hate it. Some people just get really nervous, and there's a whole wide range of emotions. But with every opportunity to speak, there is usually something enjoyable or something fun for most people. It may be that, hey, I get to tell people about this really cool thing that I'm doing. So if you can start to focus on what is actually fun or interesting or enjoyable, even if it's the outcome, you start to refocus on what you like instead of what you don't like. And then the fourth piece is you got to get out of your head. And you've got to focus on what you do well. It's so easy for all of us to be self-critical. And we always, people walk out of meetings and, I didn't do this. I didn't say this. I didn't do that well. I didn't do that well. And we end up in this negative spiral. So the next time you go into a meeting, you're already feeling bad because you're like, I didn't do any of this well last time. So instead, if you keep a running list of what you're also doing well, then you can say, okay, well, I didn't make great eye contact, but I really projected my voice. Or this time I broke into that conversation and I got their attention. And then you can start to build upon your confidence of what things you're doing well. And that will really help get you out of your head, get you away from the nervousness, and again, focus on what you're trying to say and breaking into conversation.
I love that so much. You say, get out of your head. We all have those inner voices. Mine is an inner critic. My inner voice is never saying, Annette, you are rocking it. You go, girl. You're awesome. It's always, oh, what did I say? Did I put my foot in my mouth? Or, I feel, that whole imposter syndrome thing. And so I love that idea of making a list of what you are doing well, because that is so important. And I know we have some questions here, so I am going to save a couple of these for a little bit later.
Okay.
If you're, well, actually, let's go for a couple. So Paula is just saying, this is my friend Paula, my friend and colleague. For job interviews, the fun, enjoyable part is that you might land an amazing opportunity. So great advice. Thank you, Paula, for commenting. And my buddy Tom, another one of my buddies here, he says the challenge in job interviews, 50% of the time, you need to respond to questions, construct the answers, and communicate them well. Tom is a buddy of mine. He is has a resume, does resumes, and also he is also a recruiter. So the thing with, I just want to ask you quickly, as far as the job interviews go, I know that I tell clients that I work with, common advice is to practice a few of the common questions. For example, tell me about yourself. Everyone that goes into a job interview, the interviewer asks them some form of tell me about yourself. And people often will go and say, well, I started my career in marketing and I really loved it. And then I went to this company, and 5 minutes later, they're rambling on and they have, so if someone is going to, since I know interview coaching is kind of something that you do a little bit of as well, correct? That what would be your recommendation for someone who's prepping for a question like that? How to prepare for it?
Sure. And interview questions are really interesting. And I saw the comment from your friend as well, is that half the time you have to respond to questions on the fly, which is absolutely true. But interview questions, a large chunk of them are those common questions that we all know. It's tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, tell me about a challenging time or a challenging situation or teammate, tell me about a time you did something really well, overcame a challenge. I mean, you have a lot of these different types of questions, but they're fairly common types. So, like you said, you're going to get something about the tell me about yourself. What you want to do is think about it in a holistic fashion. So if you look at your resume and you can pull out a theme and say, well, this is the theme of what I've done really well, it can be more thematic. It doesn't have to be chronological. So I see that a lot where people will say, okay, tell me about yourself. And then they go back into time and they start at the beginning of work history and then fast forward. And half an hour later, you've gotten to the end. The other way of doing it is actually starting in reverse chronology. So starting with the most important and the most recent job experience first, which is probably, not always, but probably more like this next job that you're interviewing for. So you can pull out and highlight some of the most relevant experience from your latest one, and then go back and cherry pick the ones that you want them to know about. They've got your resume already, so you don't actually need to go through every single piece of detail. But I do like the idea of doing something that's a little bit thematic, where it's, if you tell me about yourself, well, here, let me tell you something that's not on paper, because you've seen the resume. So let me bring to life something else about your personality, about what drives you, and something that can really pull together all of the job experiences that you've had.
That's fabulous. I've heard something similar before about the cherry picking that, and I know the clients that I work with, most people are focusing on 3 areas. Might be leadership, and the other one might be business transformation, and the other one might be just very much sort of industry or job related, and that they can pick things to highlight that show different skills, that show different things they want to get across. So I've heard that, but I really like that idea of let me share something that's not on paper, something that you don't already know. And I think that may be a great way to start the conversation. And it's also, it makes people memorable. I don't want to get into the long thing about LinkedIn, but one of the things about LinkedIn with someone's about section is they want to make sure that that they're memorable. So if they share something that's really interesting.
And to your point about having those different themes, and you could pick out, like you said, leadership or operations. one of the things you could do is, if you know who you're talking to, and again, this goes back to that audience analysis piece, think about what might resonate with that person more. If you're talking to a COO and you want to highlight operating experience, well, that might be a good conversation to highlight the operations, and maybe you'll get into a more in-depth conversation about operations. So you can always use that as a jumping off point to try to tee up a conversation that you want to have.
Yeah. And you are reinforcing something that people like me say all the time. It needs to be a two-way conversation. You're not just sitting there like it's an interrogation. You
Right.
do want to make it a conversation. It's much more effective, I think, for everyone.
Yes.
You get to know them, they get to know you, which is so important. I do want to ask you though about a little bit about public speaking, because once someone reaches that executive level, they are often asked to represent the company at a conference. Maybe they're on a panel, or they're, invited to speak, conferences, seminars, and things like that. So,
Mhm.
what advice would you have for someone, who's new to that?
If you're new to that circuit and you're just starting off speaking, there are a number of things to think about when you're on a panel or you're speaking at a conference. And the first is to really think about, what's the story you're trying to tell? So if you go back and think, what's your key point? And there should really be one key point for whatever it is that you're trying to say, because that's what your audience can latch onto. And then if you step back and think, if you're the keynote speaker and you're the only one who's speaking, that's going to be a little bit different from a panel discussion
Mm-hmm.
where you're one of many. But if you're the keynote, then you really want to think about your story. And there really should be this overarching feel from beginning to end that holds your audience's attention. So you've got to think about, how do you start? How do you get them engaged? How do you build up the story? What is that tipping point or that climax of the story? How does everything unravel at the end? And then what is that resolution? It's really that story arc. And even if it's something in a business setting, there's usually a story that you can pull out of it. And that makes it much more engaging for your audience to listen to. So if you can figure out the story first, then you figure out the key points you want to add under each section of the story. That will make everything flow very nicely and help it feel like one cohesive talk. Now, if you're speaking on a panel, then you're going to be speaking in much shorter bursts of time. So you've got 30 seconds or a couple of minutes at most at one time. And there you've got to keep your language very succinct and very focused. I see a lot of people who are new to the circuit start rambling, and they're not sure. They start answering the question and they start here and then they keep going and then they're not sure and they turn and they turn and they turn. And there's a lot of airtime and you're still not clear on what they were trying to say. So if you can take that deep breath and very quickly think about a structure, or if you can't think of a structure, think of the highlight. If they've asked for key points, to say, well, here's the first one that comes to mind. And when you're short on time, you don't need to go through the entire laundry list. You can say the biggest area or the key point or the most important thing, focus on that first. And then if something else pops to mind while you're talking, you can always add in, oh, here's another point to consider as well. So
Yeah.
that's for those short bursts.
No, that makes perfect sense, because I agree also. Sometimes people are on panels and they start rambling. They take the time from, other people, or from what the host or of the panel is, or the moderator is trying to get across, maybe on the topic. So I really, really love that. And my buddy Tom just is thanking you, speaking about something that's not on the resume. This is about yourself and relevant to the job or company mission. So it is so important. You want to help those job interviewers connect the dots, right? You want to. So I noticed, I was looking over, your LinkedIn profile, and I saw that before you moved into speaking and coaching, you worked as a strategy consultant. But a lot of the work that you were doing seems to be focused on managing relationships, and also on training. So, was that part of what sort of prompted your move to coaching when you left there? How does that all kind of tie together?
Yeah, sure. That's actually a good question. when I was working as a strategy consultant, I noticed one thing, that was the people I was working with, most of my clients were very smart. They understood the data, they understood the analysis. We'd run through the financial piece, we'd run through the strategic piece, they would get it. And there was no problem there. Everybody was on board. But where the challenge came in was in that next step of them pitching it to someone else, usually internally, could be to the C-suite, could be to a board of directors, could be to other shareholders or stakeholders. And if they didn't get that communication piece right, then it didn't matter how good the idea was. It was going to get shelved. So that's where I started focusing a little bit more on that last piece of the communication and saying, okay, talk to me. Who are you talking to and how is this going to work? And, I remember one client who said, oh, I'm just going to wing it. And he was going in to talk to the CEO. And I said, the CEO, I don't think that's the best strategy. And the CEO was a very buttoned up type of person who liked everything very structured. My client was not quite as structured, a little bit more free for all. So I worked with him on creating the structure. And he's like, I don't really think this makes a difference, but sure, I'll take your advice, basically just to humor me. He's like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. And then he called me the next day thrilled when he's like, I don't know how that worked, but it worked. How did that work? What did you do? And I said, it's just about knowing your audience and figuring out how you communicate and speak their language. So you got to take that idea and put it in that no-brainer language that someone else is going to understand. So that was where I realized there was a big gap on that communication side. And so I started moving away from consulting and decided to start my own practice of speaking and coaching.
I do love that. And it's a great way when you're looking for a job too. A lot of the executives that I work with, one of their skills is being able to get buy-in for whatever the project or idea or whatever from the boss, from the board, depending on how high up they are in a company. And when you can give that as an example, certainly if on the job, it's great if you can do that. And when you can give those as examples, you don't have to talk about having great communication skills. If you are consistently able to get buy-in for projects and get things, build consensus and get things done, that shows that you have those communication skills.
Absolutely. And so much of this, to your point earlier, is based on those relationships and forming relationships, understanding people, understanding how to get things done. And forming relationships, you can have all kinds of relationships. You can have just functional working relationships. You can have more meaningful relationships. But you have to just think about, again, what's your goal here? What are you trying to get done? And if you're going to be effective at your job, you've got to figure out how to work with the other person. And sometimes that's really easy and sometimes that's very difficult. But there is always that two-way street of figuring out there is somebody else I have to work with, unless you're in a silo by yourself, in which case it doesn't matter. But when you have to work with anybody else, there is that two-way street. You need something, they need something. You have to figure out how to get it done. And so communication becomes really, really important. One thing, just as a side note that I've seen, is that we have a huge gap in generations in the workforce because we have 5 generations in the workforce. And sometimes that communication style is very different depending on what generation person is talking to another one.
Yeah. So can you give us a quick tip on sort of analyzing that before I move on? Because I have another, a couple other things I want to ask you.
Sure. Well, with intergenerational communication, again, it's thinking about the other person. So I may love email, and that might be my go-to. But if somebody else is really fast on text or on Slack, and I need to talk to them and I need to work on them, it might be worth it to just switch what you're saying to a different mode of communication and try to get into their line of thinking quickly. So that's just a quick example. We could talk about intergenerational communication for hours.
Perhaps you'll have to come back and we can talk about
that.
But I do, I do hear that. And for one of the things I have added, my clients, I have them, they can text me if they want to, because sometimes people would rather just text than email or call or something, but it's good to know their communication. So I have to ask you, what do you enjoy most about what you do?
Ooh, if I just had to pick one thing, I would say it is the effect on other people when they see themselves become better speakers. So for me, I have seen friends, now friends, many clients who were self proclaimed wallflowers. And then you see them turn and grow into something they never imagined possible. And to see them then on a speaking circuit or doing TED Talks or being on TV, it's very exciting to me to know that I help them accomplish their goals and get to a place where they are rocking it and making the world turn.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So I always like to ask everyone, what is something that would surprise people about you?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure there's too many surprises because I'm a pretty open book, but I do have a lot of hobbies that are outside of work.
Okay,
So, one thing
that's
that
cool.
people would not know is that I was a dancer for about 35 years. So I did a lot of, I was trained in classical dance, and then I was a competitive dancer in college. And then I switched styles and I was a performer for many, many years as a side hobby, in addition to all of my other day jobs.
Wow, that is so cool. So when you were competitive dancing, was that what type of dancing was that?
That was a style called Bhangra, which is an Indian dance. So I
Oh,
was a collegiate competitive dancer.
oh, that is so cool. It is so cool. Dancing is near and dear to my heart. So, I perked up as soon as I heard that. Um, it's so the last question I have for you, and as I mentioned, I have each of my guests give me a question to ask the next guest. Then they have no idea who it is. But my question is, how did your earlier career choices lead you to where you are now? And you can, I noticed there was something, even you were at Toys R Us for a bit. So how does your whole, the career get you where you are?
It's actually a funny question because if you look at my resume, it can look very jumpy in the sense that I worked in so many different fields and different industries. And, I dabbled in, politics for a little bit. I worked in international development consulting. I worked in retail. I did government consulting. I did strategy consulting. And so there's all these different industries and different fields. And even if you include internships, I did some social work. So it feels very random. But as I look back on it and look at the thread that connected it, it was really a lot of this relationship building and a lot of the communication. Those were my strengths in each one of those jobs. So even let's say when I was doing international development consulting, part of the reason I was so good at my job was not because of the financial side. I could do the financial side, that was no problem. But what made me really good was that we had different people in different offices. We had our home office in DC, we had our field offices in different countries, and they were talking past each other. And so my strength was bringing them together and getting them to focus and talk to each other. And so if I look at each one of those jobs, there is that thread that keeps going through. There's the strategy and then there's the communication. And that's really what I focus on now is strategic communication.
Yeah, I love that, and I see that with people that I work with, clients that I work with. There generally is some kind of a theme, and as we talk, and I look at their old resume, which might be looks like people are jumping around, but you can see there are often themes. I would say most often there are themes in everyone's career, what they're doing. So we're getting sort of near the end, and I'd like to ask you if you can share, something that maybe you wish I would have asked you that I didn't, that you some advice, last thoughts, final thoughts, whatever, with people, that would be great.
I think the last thing I would say, and we touched upon this at the beginning, but really what I want to focus on is that speaking is not inherent, and nobody is just born a naturally good speaker. That is, we all learn. and we're all capable of learning. And so I think the real big takeaway here is that if you want to become a better speaker or a better communicator, or you have to because of your job and you're starting to do more of these speaking engagements or leading teams or leading meetings, if you're feeling nervous or you're not feeling good about it or you don't like it at all, then really think about how do you build your team of people to help you become better. And a coach might be part of that team, and other colleagues or mentors might be part of that team. But you have to believe that you can change. And I think a lot of this is a mindset. So if you can believe that you can change and you can believe that you can learn, then really the world is open. And that includes all of the speaking engagements.
Mm-hmm.
You can become a much better speaker if you're willing to try.
You know, I love that, because I think so many of us, and we touched on this also earlier, we are our own worst critics. We would never, and I think also I learned from a speaking coach years ago, was giving a presentation when I was just starting to speak to job seeker groups. And one of the things that holds some people back, if they are speaking or if they're doing video, because all of everything you've said has come in, is so important with video as well, is people are concerned about, how they look and how people are going to be judging them. I'd like to be thinner and younger, and better looking, but you kind of are who you are. But one of the things that this person said in her presentation was that people don't care what you look like. And while you do want to be a better speaker, they don't care so much what you sound like. They're most interested in the message, in how it is going to help them. And again, not to discount the speaking, but do you think that just trying to remember that, and to think that the audience also, they are rooting for you, right? I mean, they're not hoping you fail. They're not saying, "Oh, gee, I wish you would fall over." They're hoping. So,
right.
What's your take on all of that?
I would say that you're right in that audiences do tend to be fairly generous and forgiving. And I think that is absolutely true, is that people are rooting for you. People want you to do well. Nobody's hoping that you're boring and put them to sleep, or that you fall on your face or anything like that. I will say, that said, it's not that the rest doesn't matter. And especially on
Yes.
Zoom, the first thing that people see is this much of you.
Yes.
And your background. So it's not so much that everything needs to be pristine. It's more that it needs to not distract from what you're doing. And the same thing with your visuals. If you can keep eye contact with the camera, it's not natural because you want to look at the screen. But the camera eye contact makes it feel like you're talking to the other person. But little things, like you have to make sure your lighting is okay. You have to make sure your camera is positioned well. Nobody wants to be looking up your nose or down at your forehead. So, it's little things. But again, I wouldn't, stress about, oh, do I have a pimple right here or not? I mean, that type of thing, again, nobody's going to pay attention to. I'm thinking more of like the big picture visuals of making sure just things look appropriate and it's easy to see you and understand you, so it's not distracting.
Well, I love all of that, and I thank you so much for being here. What's the best place for people to find you? I know I connected with you on LinkedIn. What are the best ways for people to find you?
Absolutely. LinkedIn is the best way to find me. It's Monisha Toteja. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ping me there. You can also go to my website, which is www.dynamic-speaking.com.
Okay. Well, again, I thank you so much for being here. It's such a treat. I hope you will come back and we can talk about some of these other things, because I know it's helpful for me and I know it will be helpful for many others. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day, and goodbye.
Thank you.